Doubles and coffee. When I was telling you that Keith Rowley, Stuart Smallpin Young, Colm Imbert, the PNM government, was the most arrogant, tyrannical, oppressive, disrespectful, disdainful government in the history of Trinidad and Tobago, some of y'all didn't believe. A lot of y'all did. And therefore April 28, 2025 came. But now, after long deliberation, submissions, evidence, cross-examination, a judge has come out with a scathing judgment against Keith Rowley and Stuart Smallpin Young. Remember when they keep telling you COVID-19, they were the best. In fact, they went into an election in 2020 when the results should have been similar to that which occurred on April 28, 2025. And many of you, some of you intelligent people with degrees and masters were telling me that the PNM was doing so well with COVID, even though at that time, just before the election, they had done no testing. They had only done 2,645 tests. There was no curve. There was not enough testing for a population to create any curve. The oppressive closure of the border without rationale, without reason, the leaving of citizens to suffer outside, while the PNM played God and determined who could come in and who has to stay out. People, nurses were left in Barbados for Mia Amor Motley and her government to see about our citizens after they had gone to South Africa on a trip, on a retirement holiday together. People were crying. Do you remember that video of one Miss Joanne Pantin, a lady who had been caught outside when Smallpin Young and Rowley closed the borders? And she did a video that you saw the pain, the frustration, the mental depression of this lady just being cast away without being able to come home to her home where she had been born. And you saw the pain on her face as she ran out of money. She was bordering on starvation, disrespected, felt unloved, uncared for. And Stuart Smallpin Young, Convan Gyaldial Singh, Keith Rowley, and some doctors who were playing politics rather than being professional, and then were rewarded with the Order of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. That's where we first met this Richards woman with she half of a face mask on and Rowley flirting during a press conference. Take your minds back. People couldn't come home. Open fire cremation. People could not burn their dead in their Hindu rites. Total discrimination without science. Dying people all over. 5,000 people dead. People in tents without oxygen. People dying at home. A total calamitous failure. But remember, the PNM saying we're #1 in the world because 2 drunk Oxford students heard the statements of Rowley, Stuart Smallpin Young, and Convan Gyal that we were banning the citizens from coming home. And because of that strong, insane, oppressive language without science, they decided that Trinidad and Tobago was quite good and strong with their COVID policy because citizens' rights to come home were being denied. Remember that? Remember Party Group 13 with Jelani and Stuart Smallpin Young? Do you recall? Or I want to take your minds back where a lady, a PNM lady in a PNM meeting on a PNM virtual, somebody recorded it, and Stuart Smallpin Young, the only human being who was granted the honor and the power to determine whether citizens could come home to the land of their birth, and he was wielding it with a kind of arrogance that he said, talk to Jelani and you will be organized to come home, whether you were working out on a cruise line and you got caught, whether you were on holiday, whether you were out checking your children who were studying. These PNM were determining without policy, without telling you what is relevant and what is irrelevant and who will be able to come home. A man dog come home while people couldn't come home to bury their dead. Do you remember that COVID-19 arrogant, tyrannical, oppressive, dictatorial reign of terror brought down by Keith Rowley and Stuart Smallpin Young, when Delcy Rodriguez was allowed to land just when a shipment of fuel was coming from Italy with Wilmer Ruperti, Trafigura PTE into Paria, into Pointe-à-Pitre, and it left on the Aldan, and the Aldan switched up its transponder and took it to Palo Alto, Venezuela, in the height of sanctions against Maduro and his wicked tyrannical regime. Remember that? Stuart Smallpin Young allowed Delcy Rodriguez and PDVSA officials to land on a sanctioned jet, but you couldn't come home. Miss Pantin couldn't come home. Rihanna Lorick couldn't come home. People couldn't come home when their mommy and their daddy died. People couldn't bury their dead. They couldn't burn them because of these dictators. Do you recall that? Well, the truth travels slowly, but its arrival is sure. And there's been a judgment now against Keith Rowley, against Stuart Smallpin Young, against the PNM. One of the most scathing judgments in the history of Trinidad and Tobago, stating that it was tyrannical, it was oppressive, it was unconstitutional, it was unfair, that some people were getting preferential treatment to go back and forth based on the whims and fancies of the PNM, based on the whims and the fancies of Rowley and Stuart Smallpin Young, as he was the Minister of National Security, the sole person who could determine who could come home and who had to stay outside and suffer. But Annan Ramlogan, and all you better say that name, Annan Ramlogan, Freedom Law Chambers, based on the judgment handed down yesterday in the case of Rihanna Lorick and Josan Pantin, that poor lady that we empathize with and sympathize with, versus the PNM Attorney General, versus Faris Al-Rawi, versus Lymore, versus Rowley, versus Smallpin, versus Convent Geldy Singh. This is what Annan Ramlogan had to say in summarizing the judgment. This is a historic and a landmark judgment that signals a major development in our constitutional jurisprudence as it relates to the right to liberty and freedom of movement. It is also a stinging indictment on the way the PNM administration managed the reopening of our borders during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the government decided to allow citizens who were stranded overseas to re-enter the country. Minister Young refused to publish the factors or criteria that would be taken into account in deciding who would be allowed to re-entry, and when the court has quite rightly described this as the epitome of arbitrariness, because it meant distressed and aggrieved citizens were essentially shooting in the dark while the PNM played God over you, while their arrogance and their hubris brought pain and suffering to you and brought freedom and empathy and happiness to those who were at Balize House, building Balize House, friends, financiers, and people of influence. In the meantime, however, the privileged 1% political financiers, friends, and supporters were being granted privileged access to information that was kept a secret. Remember? Call Jelani now. Were you work by party group, what? 13? Being allowed to return home. Hundreds of our poor and vulnerable citizens who were simply told to shelter in place were simply left grieving and distressed in the dark. The cruel irony is that many of the persons were rendered homeless and barely able to survive. But whilst their pleas were callously ignored, those privileged with privileged access to the government were able to return home. Don't a man, dog, and thing return home. All you remember that? Let me quote some of the statements directly from the judgment of the learned judge. The evidence of the Attorney General makes clear, meaning the PNM Attorney General, both directly and by implication, that the full policy of factors considered by the Minister was not made known to the public prior to the proceedings being initiated. That evidence also showed that the disclosures made by the minister at press conferences only scratched the surface of the factors. And remember, an election was held in August of 2020, and the little sway, the little increase that PNM got was because they were in press conferences and you, the people, were thinking they were #1 in the world while we were dying, while COVID was coming through the open, porous borders. No COVID came through the airport, in normal scientific circumstances, with temperature, with verification, and so on. COVID came across the open, porous borders. I did video after video showing you all the vessels park up and just illegal immigrants walking across on boats to Trinidad and Tobago with every variant known to man. The Brazilian variant wreaked havoc and killed our family members. Remember that? The minute it was done to exercise of the minister's discretion, Stuart Young's discretion, that arrogant hater, that imbecile. The effect of the non-disclosure was that nationals making applications were essentially shooting in the dark and hoping that the application captured all that had purchased with the minister. That is the epitome of arbitrariness, says the learned judge. The judge continued. Let me find another quote from the judgment coming down scathing against the PNM. As we go ahead, that it is a certainty, not my intention here. Rather, it is to uphold the Constitution, the constitutional rights conferred by Section 4 and 5, and in particular the right to liberty, are hard-won rights. The trials inflicted upon our ancestors by slavery and the slave trade, with the mass deprivation of liberty and lives, are matters of record. So too the trials of indentureship. We must never surrender or compromise our hard-won rights and freedom for which our ancestors paid so dearly. Such compromise usually begins with the most innocuous of executive actions. As judges, we are sworn to uphold the Constitution and the law. No matter how compelling the emergency, the executive must always be held accountable for infringements of the rights and freedoms of our citizens. As a people, we must demand nothing less. The learned judge continued. Democratic Commonwealth states such as New Zealand and Australia had similar closures, but such drastic action that once an exemption policy was decided upon, it was incumbent to have a fair policy, including criteria for permitting entry. Once it was decided that some would be let in immediately and others would have to wait a longer time, there must have been published criteria to guide how those permissions would be granted. If they were not, then arbitrariness would follow. It would mean that it was up to the minister to decide without limitation. He could allow one in and exclude another for no reason. And that power was in the hands of the PNM, in the hands of Rowley, in the hands of Stuart Smallpenny Young. And he wielded it with an oppressive bias, with a nefarious nepotism. That is the PNM. The PNM must never forget this, that you, the citizens, and many of you who had voted PNM, who were historical PNM, but poor PNM, black PNM, hard-working PNM, laboring PNM, were left outside to suffer without home, without money, without food, while the PNM, real big Bangalang, were allowed to come back and forth, have weddings, go outside, come in, go and shop, come in private jets, bring their puppies back. This was the PNM, and this is why April 28, 2025 was a godsend. So you now see the truth. The PNM, after investigation, submissions, analysis, argument, and cross-examination has been found wanting, they shall be relegated in the annals of history as the most tyrannical, oppressive government in history. Bless.